I think it's safe to say number one's gonna surprise you. We are honestly probably about 2 years away before we even get to see Armor Wars on Disney+. But I'm already excited enough that I want to talk about which comic book characters I want to see in the series. A quick synopsis of the Armor Wars comic book story. Tony Stark finds out that his tech has been stolen to create enemy battlesuits, and he goes on a warpath to ensure that every last battlesuit or armor is destroyed and unusable. And I know that in the MCU, Iron Man is dead, and I know that the series is going to focus more on Rhodey, but I actually think that's pretty smart because Rhodey is basically a second main character in the Armor War comic book story. Now this list is completely based on only comic book characters that have not been established in the MCU, but I will be doing a second part to this video where I do talk about the MCU characters that I want to see in the Armor War series. You'll be able to watch it right here. I honestly see three kind of story arcs or three themes that could happen in the Disney Plus series. The first one is Rhodey going up against the government, Rhodey going up against popular opinion, and then Rhodey not necessarily going up with, but dealing with Tony Stark's legacy. And I think we're going to visit each one of those themes throughout the entire series. Let's get to the list. The number 7 character that I want to see in the Armor Wars series is Stiltman. Stiltman starts off this list for purely absurdity's sake. His strength is literally the power of stilts. I know his legs are pretty powerful, but his story arc in the comics is literally 3 pages long. But come on, who doesn't want to see a live action Stiltman? Also, they're vacuuming my office, so sorry if you can hear that. Number 6 is the Controller. Now, the Controller doesn't play a giant part in the Armor Wars comic book story, but his story arc of, controlling people, I actually think could translate well into live action. And the Controller has actually had a very storied past with Iron Man, and he's always been kind of like one of my favorites that Iron Man has fought against. I personally would really love to see an actual live action Controller, and that could possibly live on or maybe like behind the scenes beyond this series. And number 5 is Stingray. In the Iron Wars comic book story, Stingray is honestly just another battle suit that Iron Man tries to find out if it was stolen through Stark Tech, and he ultimately ends up realizing that it isn't. But the cool part of their fight is Stingray, aka Walter Newell, is actually guarding the East Coast Avengers base, also known as Hydro Base. And that technically in the comics is a government property. And in the Disney Plus series, having Stingray protect some kind of government property, pitting him against the MCU Rhodey, who, and I believe I'm correct, is still technically an active Air Force officer, would make a great storyline. Specifically because Stingray is actually an aquatic superhero who actually ends up joining the Avengers later. Did you hear that? They're vacuuming right outside my door. And number 5 is Firepower. In the Armor Wars comic book story, Edwin Cord, through government funding, creates the Firepower armor, which then gets piloted by Jack Taggart. And the final act of the story is actually Firepower versus Iron Man. And again, bringing the whole government aspect into it for the Disney Plus series, I think it'd be awesome to have Rhodey, a government official, fighting a government-funded, created armor and Firepower. Now, the unfortunate part is that Jack Taggart is actually already established in the MCU as the race-switched, pretty underwhelming, not my favorite character in Iron Man 3 that blows up the Chinese theater. So they would have to create a whole new character that's hopefully racially correct. I do hope that Firepower is actually a person in an armor, not a robot like they did in the 90s Iron Man animated series. Number 3 is Marcy Pearson. In the Armor Wars comic book story, Marcy is actually the head of PR, like the PR chief for Stark Enterprises, and she's put through the ringer, specifically because of the way the public turns on Iron Man, and how Tony Stark kind of treats her and his company throughout the whole story. Some of y'all might be a tad bit confused on why I placed her so high on this list. It's basically because if they write her well and she's in this series, I think we could get a ton of character development, character growth, characterization of Rhodey in this series. Especially if she is the avenue in which we learn about the public's turning on Rhodey or even Iron Man and how Rhodey deals with it, I think would be so sweet in the series. It could also bring a romantic side to the series because in the comics, Marcy and Rhodey are also dating. And number Number 2 is kind of a cheat because it's Crimson Dynamo and Titanium Man. Their entire contribution to the Armor Wars comic book story is Iron Man issue 229, where Iron Man basically goes over to Russia and destroys both of them. The reason why I placed these two specific characters so high on this list is because I think they are perfect for this kind of series. They both have battlesuit armors, they both have crazy storied past with Iron Man, and they both can honestly be used in the story and then killed off and not worried about in the future. They are both perfect villains for a limited series. I personally hope it's more so Crimson Dynamo because the person who is Crimson Dynamo during the Armor Wars comic book story is the quintessential Crimson Dynamo, and I'd actually love to get that kind of story and that kind of character in the live action Disney Plus series. And if you'd like to know where to read both of their origins, check out my video right here. And the number one character that I want to see in the Disney Plus Armor Wars series is Tony's mullet. I am completely serious about this. Iron Man's 80s mullet is iconic. It is one of the defining features of him as a character throughout the entire 80s. I know it's a little outlandish to put Tony's mullet as the number one thing I want to see in the series, but there's nothing more that I want to see than a flashback photo of a mullet slapped onto the head of Robert Downey Jr. And those are the 7 characters that I need to see in the Armor Wars Disney Plus series. And just as my friend Sean Chandler says, this isn't the right list, this is my list, so let me know your list or other characters that I missed. There are a few down in the comment section down below that you'd want to see in the Disney Plus Armor Wars series. Watch this video right here if you'd rock an 80s Tony Stark mullet. Thank you so much for watching, and I love you 3000.